Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week's news has a range of events that are worth noting. First, we have a 62-year-old man from Germany who has been vaccinated at least 217 times by their own records. A new treatment using a cannabis extract is supposedly deadly against various melanomas. Leaked documents show how gender reassignment surgery is being conducted contrary to recommendations and guidelines. The unexpected, although not well evidenced, risk of losing weight and the increased risk of cancer associated therewith. Conspiracy theorists are taking advantage of the as yet unknown Disease X. Claims that boiling tap water can remove plastics, but unfortunately this is not the whole story. A universal snake venom could be very near at hand, although not yet. Ultra-processed foods are harmful, or at least that's what The Guardian has to say. A plan to stop glaciers melting will cost us billions of dollars, and sadly not involve importing ice from Pluto. Graphene is safe in a first-of-a-kind human trial. OpenAI responds to Elon Musk, and the ISS has sprung an air leak, but NASA's not panicking yet. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with what's going to trigger every anti-vaxxer, and their dog, and their neighbor, and their neighbor's dog probably. It's proof that vaccinations do not cause problems, or at least not the COVID vaccine. This is based on the fact that if there was a problem, it should have shown up after at least a few of the vaccines the 60-year-old man from Germany received, let alone the full 217 times. Let's be clear about this. Anti-vaxxers claim that the various vaccines that are out there cause issues, or that they cause those in the anti-vaxxers' proximity to die. This is known as anti-vaxxer proximity condition, and it's why anti-vaxxers claim that people around them are dropping dead at a constant rate as though they lived in midsummer. The case study was published in The Lancet and shows that the man received all of these vaccines within 29 months, so roughly 2.5 years. And yet he appears to have no real adverse effects. And to be honest with you, we would have expected him to see some sort of adverse effect, if only in the form of elevated immunological responses, such as a high fever, or similar, yet he doesn't appear to be in that situation. In further news that will disappoint and sadden anti-vaxxers, no, ivermectin will do nothing for you, and now a very large trial has shown this to not only be the case, but that any benefits that may theoretically occur are practically negligible. To start with, the study looked at ivermectin, and specifically they were analysing whether or not about 8,000 individuals, it's actually 8,800, who were given ivermectin, given the usual care, or were given a range of other treatments, had any differences between them. Now, the only differences that were going to be found had to do with self-reported recovery, and it's only a day or two shorter, so we're not talking about anything that's really worth noting. The reason this 1 or 2 day improvement is not worth noting is down to the fact that it's partly self-reported, but also because it's self-reported and it's based on a recovery rather than a serological or a blood test result, it's really hard to say whether or not the individuals are just feeling better, think they're feeling better, or if they're actually better. That's why a few days like this isn't really important. By contrast, however, the issues with giving ivermectin, amongst other medications that are touted as a solution, are that the side effects and complications of treatment, effectively adverse events and reactions, are going to more or less outweigh the benefits of those 1 or 2 days, because individuals who have something like heart conditions, blood pressure, dialysis requirements, so on and so forth, all easily are going to have much worse outcomes than simply saving 1 or 2 days for some people. In other clinical news, we have a study claiming that cannabis can help with treating melanomas. It's important to say, however, that this is based on cell culture and incredibly high doses of the specific extract from cannabis. And let's be clear about it. We're talking about one particular compound from the cannabis extracted and then used. But the actual, let's say, study itself is further flawed. The researchers took their cell culture and then they took up to 200% of the known lethal dose of this drug and put it in the cell culture for up to 24 hours. Now, let's be clear about this. A lethal dose, as in they've given twice as much as is known to need to kill these cells in their cell culture, and then they're claiming that they found a lethal result. And most people are already going to be shouting at their screen, no shit, that's what they found. And yes, that's the point. It is, however, worth us saying, to be clear about it, that there was a range of between 50% of the IC50, or lethal dose, and 200% of the IC50. And therein lies the crux of the problem. What they found is not necessarily a real result that could be anywhere near useful as is. However, if, and this is the big if, the particular compound that is responsible could either be delivered in a more efficacious manner, or it could be modified to be more efficacious, you could theoretically use this as a treatment for melanoma, and in different countries, melanomas are incredibly prevalent. In this case, the study was based in Australia, which is particularly known for issues to do with skin cancer. On the other hand, this really doesn't show much of anything right now. It's also not a good reason to start smoking cannabis in the hopes it would cure your particular melanoma. The only real relief you'll get is that, well, you're going to be stoned and therefore not able to appreciate the discomfort. Shifting to more clinical news rather than research news, we have leaked files from one of the world's leading transgender healthcare organizations. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, leaked documents tend not to go in the favor of the organization they're being leaked from. And in this case, it is evidence that they are pushing hormones and surgical transition for minors. Unfortunately, this isn't exactly a good thing. In this case, it's because what they're doing is not in line with the best guidelines that are available, and in some ways runs completely contrary to these guidelines. It's unfortunate, as there is a very large gap between being supportive of kids and helping them in terms of supporting their transition for those who actually need this, as they are experiencing gender dysphoria, and the often, unfortunately, more prevalent misdiagnoses for kids who are autistic, those who are experiencing, well, just normal childish behavior, such as being a tomboy for a girl, or being slightly more effeminate for a man. And then there are others who are homosexual who are being reassigned for no reason other than that's what they think they need. Which is one of the issues here. A part of the problem that's being presented is that the guidelines that were in place had minimum age requirements for just about all of the procedures that are now being embraced and endorsed at this time. The group has tried to push those ages down a lot. For example, 16 years old to start hormones and 17 years old for surgery. The new, let's say, the guidelines there are trying to push forward, mostly because they push the ages of those who are being transitioned to much below those that are recommended. For example, 16 years old is the general age for hormone therapy, there are children as young as 10 and more often as young as 13. So we're talking about between 6 and 3 years younger than the recommended ages. Surgery again is another issue, and the information contained in the New York Post article goes through this in much greater detail, particularly the conflict between internal discussions and what they present externally. In other similar sorts of news, we have the effects of fasting on your health. Fasting by itself can be conducted for religious reasons, cultural reasons, and more. But one of the practices is done purely for health and well-being, and notably weight loss. Fasting is effectively trying to trick your body into thinking that you're temporarily running out of food, a famine-type period, and therefore kick into effect the evolutionary adaptations that allow you to more effectively avoid issues around weight loss without having at the same time the issues to do with, actual famine responses, because that would prevent you from losing weight. The research was, let's be frank about this, it was limited. It's a relatively small study using 12 individuals, 5 women and 7 men. They had them on a water fasting diet, which is basically drink as much water as you want, you just can't have any calories for about a week. They took blood tests before, during, and after, so everything so far is, quite frankly put, fairly well established. The design is reasonably good, albeit a very small sample size, and the data they're collecting is reasonably definitive. What they found was that it's only after 3 days of calorie restrictions, that's dieting, that you get the results that you would expect to see. The problem is, fasting for 3 days, let alone 7, is really not a great situation to find yourself in, particularly as it encourages dieting patterns that are not healthy, and that's putting it very nicely. In other weight loss related news, and something that no doubt the fat acceptance movement will be throwing a party over, although probably not jumping for joy, although we probably hear that, it's that losing weight, at least in this study, was associated with an increased risk of 13 types of cancer. Now, the very first thing that should jump out to you is that any time something like this says it's related to 13 kinds of cancer, they're probably not actually finding a relationship. And that's because one thing having so many cancers related to it is really unlikely. There are certain exceptions to that, for example, tobacco use, but in this case, that's more owing to the systemic nature of the drug delivery rather than the actual drug itself. Nevertheless, the study itself was at least somewhat significant, and we want to be clear about that somewhat because there are some very major flaws with it. First, they were following individuals for 28 years, so that sounds great. Except for one thing. They only followed up with the individuals involved every 2 years. When they did follow up with them, they would send them what is effectively a survey, and this survey required that they self-report what they think was going on. The upside to this study, or at least its major strength, is that it was 160,000 individuals who were all classified as health professionals. That's a pretty large study, but again remembering it's only a very small data set being derived from this because of how intermittent the collection is and how vague the actual data collection was. Further, the claim of relationship between weight loss and cancer is also not necessarily well established based on how they've defined those trying to lose weight. They have weight loss intentions being high for those who are both working on diet and exercise, and medium for those either trying to improve their diet or exercise, and low for those who are trying to make no improvement. But then again, if you're already at a healthy body weight and already physically active, you would be in the low category. Whereas if you were, for instance, physically active, but you were already at an okay weight, you'd be in the medium category. But if you are, for instance, preparing to engage in some sort of physical activity or sport, such as a marathon or competitive sports, you would obviously be looking at diet and exercise. But again, not necessarily looking to lose weight as such. This is where they're finding that people who were losing more than 10% of their body weight had a significantly higher risk of cancer diagnoses in the year afterwards. Although this may be putting the cart before the horse, as the cancer may be what causes the loss in body weight. It's a condition called anorexia cachexia, in which you have neither a desire to eat, nor do you have the ability to use energy properly in your body, and as a result you begin losing weight, and it's very hard to reverse, if not impossible. The last issue is that, as mentioned, the cart before the horse, as the largest risk of cancer was in the group least trying to lose weight. As such, there is a strong argument to be made that the weight loss was not being driven by any desire to lose weight, but because they had cancer. Then again, it's hard to say, given that they've only intermittently and somewhat randomly collected the data. In further news, we have, arguably both good and news for those with epilepsy. Flashing lights and clicking sounds could help you with your neurological problems, but also give you seizures. The research found that a certain stimulation using the flashing lights and clicking sounds could, theoretically, and very, very tenuously, help with Alzheimer's disease and the protein bundles within the brain, the tau bundles, that are thought to be at least partially responsible for the neurological, symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. The flashing lights and clicking sounds were given at a frequency of 40 times per second, or 40 hertz. The stimuli, let's call it, changed some of the ways in which the brain was responding. Part of this response had to do with an increase in the movement of cerebrospinal fluid. It also altered the porosity of parts of the brain, allowing for the fluid to both enter and leave more readily. This was thought to be contributing to clearing out the tau bundles. It is worth us pointing out that not only is this very preliminary, but also something conducted on mice, so it has to be taken with a lot of caution, and we mean a lot of caution, as in don't try yourself at home kind of caution. Going from clinical news to more of the world is kind of dumb and stupid news, we have conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones are profiting off of the anticipated Disease X. Disease X is a generic term referencing the next major disease we need to be worried about. So, for example, in the start of the 20th century, Disease X would have turned out to be Spanish flu. In the start of the 21st century, it would have been something like SARS, and, most recently, obviously, it would be COVID. The idea is that it's a generic reference to a disease that will come up and it will cause all kinds of problems for us. It's not a particularly exciting name, but it's a lot easier to say than trying to describe it as the mystery illness, which is slightly more fear-provoking. The challenge, at least according to the, article, is that, characters like Alex Jones are profiting off of this. They're selling products and claiming that it's all part of some grand conspiracy. Which, it's Alex Jones, that's all he does. He screams about conspiracies and gives us awesome memes that are just plain hilarious. But that's not the point. The point, apparently, is that they're profiting off of this because they're not challenged. Well, no, they're not challenged because it's kinda hard to challenge someone when they're screaming that they're turning the freaking frogs gay. Nobody takes that seriously. And even those who do take it seriously find that the actual research to substantiate it really isn't there. To be clear, there is actual research behind that claim. It's just really bad research that, well, it's kind of funny. This is why fact-checking and similar just isn't necessary. Sure, there are some conspiracy theories that it's worth taking your time to deal with, but other than that, it's just not worth the time, especially for something like Disease X, where we don't actually know what it is yet. It's kinda hard to challenge something when you don't know what it is you're challenging. In news that is rather less frustrating and annoying, we have a model organ built from cells from a living fetus, which is a slight oversimplification. What they've done is taken amniotic fluid from the mother, which is a routine test for various conditions during pregnancy, and they've used stem cells from within the amniotic fluid to develop the organoids. The organoids were things like the intestines, the liver, and so on. The idea being that this will allow the development of the organ-like structure, the organoid, and investigation of what's happening during fetal development. By understanding what happens during the fetus's growth and development, they can better deal with it when they encounter it in an actual developing fetus, rather than the organ itself. And this is the key difference. This is cells taken from actual living fetuses, whereas just about all other organoids that have been grown for most fetal research is from, well, to be none too delicate about this, aborted fetuses. As a result, they are somewhat different, to be clear. The distinctions aren't going to be significant at this point in time, mostly because the amniotic stem cell research is very novel and new, and so we lack a comparison group. But at this stage, there's no reason to see that there would be any important distinctions. Further, at least in terms of the possible applications, immediately they can use it to assess whether or not there are any avoidable or preventable issues to do with the gestating fetus well before it's born, and thereby preemptively address any problems that may come up. Admittedly, it's not exactly the most astounding or useful news, unless for some reason you want to keep a organoid of your child. This could well become the new version of keeping the child's placenta, or stem cells from cord blood. In further news that's just as useless, without understanding the full depth of what it is, boiling tap water removes plastic, or more accurately microplastics, except that's not quite true. First of all, it's not just boiling it. You need to boil it for 5 minutes and then filter it, and even then it removes 90% of microplastics, not all of it. Therein lies the crux of the problem. Most people will read the headline and go, oh, okay, I just need to boil water. No, you need to boil the water and filter it, because what the boiling does is it allows for a reaction with the water and the calcium within it to precipitate the microplastics out. But that precipitate doesn't really do anything unless you run it through a filter, which can catch that somewhat larger molecule and prevent it from flowing on to whatever you're trying to store, the water within, which would ironically in most cases be a plastic container anyway. Further to that, the harder the water, that is the more calcium carbonate, effectively chalk, in the water, the more of the plastics that were removed. And this is another consideration, that is, unless the water you are boiling has at least some mineral content in it, you're not going to get any real reduction in the microplastics. If you have, for example, spring water, you're likely to be fine, but you also probably don't have any real plastic in there to speak of. By contrast, if you use tap water, you're likely to have both. But if you have something like a rainwater tank or a well water, you're likely to not have either the presence of the calcium carbonate from a water tank, because, well, rainwater coming from the sky doesn't really have any real calcium carbonate in it, and by the time it gets to the rainwater tank and is stored, you don't have that either, but you might get plastics from the tank. By contrast, if it's well water, well, there's no plastic in the well, we hope. But there's also going to be a lot of calcium carbonate, and therein lies the problem. The circumstances and application are going to vary drastically. Shifting to some sort of animal news for you, it's why having a mate can be dangerous, or at least dangerous for mice. Apparently, smelling a new mate can cause male mice to die early. Now, this might be speaking more to the nature of relationships than does anything else, or it could just be a weird quirk found in a study. But male mice that were exposed to the scent of an unknown female died earlier. Admittedly, they were middle to old-aged mice, and this could be an example of what happens if your partner thinks you're cheating, or if you're worried your partner thinks you're cheating. This rather glib summary is actually more accurate than you might initially consider. A part of that is based on the nature of the study. What they found was that if male mice were exposed to the scent of an unknown female before they were able to sire a litter, they died younger. If they did it afterwards, it didn't have as significant effect, which would indicate that if you reproduce before cheating, you're likely to survive longer, which, yeah, that probably isn't going to help you very much. To assess what was happening, the researchers involved had 10 to 24-year-old mice kept, let's say, in a range of conditions. These conditions were either living alone, living with two females, living alone but exposed to the smell of the two absent females, and those living with two females while exposed to two absent female odors. At the end of this time frame, the researchers then gave their male mice a harem of two females, which is twice as much trouble. But it also importantly allowed them to assess whether or not the males had not only fertility, but to an extent lifespan. Those that lived with females earlier in life didn't really show any reproductive aging, whereas those that were able to smell but didn't have any females nearby had a lower fertility rate. We're not sure if this would be applicable to both incels and panty sniffers, but either way, it's not exactly relevant to humans yet. In more relevance to humans, we have a possible theoretical universal antivenom, which, well, it's a very ambitious thing to want to develop. That's because venom is very diverse. There are a wide range of different ways it can work and different targets. Some are simply able to cause cell death in the area in which you've been injured. Others are more insidious and work in a more creative way, let's say. Sometimes this is by targeting your nervous system. Other times it will eventually circulate around your body until it finds the target it needs to target to have its targeted effect. Creating a universal antivenom is very hard as a result because of the diversity of functionality. This is where you need to be a bit more creative in what you're going to be doing. This is one reason why the research and goal of a universal antivenom is not just ambitious, but likely to be impossible. However, one thing they have been able to do is begin targeting the most common features of a range of neurotoxins. These are venom from various snakes that would target your nervous system and, for example, prevent breathing or your heart from contracting. Obviously, rather important biological functions. By targeting these and creating antibodies to the common features of them, you are able to effectively counteract the venom and thereby have one antivenom that would work against a broad range of venom from different snakes, spiders, and so on. The only way that you could create a universal antivenom that would be based on the same concept would be if you had a cocktail of antibodies. That is, various antibodies that would target different kinds of venom. For example, neurotoxins are just one category, But if you have things like the amygdaloids that would stop the heart from beating properly, distinct and separate from those that affect the nervous system, you would have to counteract that too, let alone the other possible mechanisms by which venom could kill you. In more environmental news, we have the possibility of being able to create a far hotter chili pepper than what currently exists. The researchers looked into the genome of the various chilies that are out there. Having looked at the full genome, they found that there are both inactive genes and pathways that exist within the chili that would allow for the creation of caspasinoids. These are the active ingredient in chili that make them not only incredibly hot, but also useful as a spray. The difference is that these are a secondary metabolite, and what's important there is that because it is a secondary metabolite, it's something that's produced as a result of other processes. But if you could turn them on and make them active without having to rely on this secondary process, you could make your regular chili much spicier. How spicy would be a very different question, however. What gets even more interesting is that although you could do this in caspase-carrying species like chili, you can also do so in other similar related species, such as the tomato. Shifting to food-related research, we have claims, and they're very nebulous claims, that ultra-processed food is linked to 32 harmful effects. This is like saying that breathing is linked to death. No shit. And in this case, the ultra-processed food and harmful effects are just as badly related. It's effectively saying that one thing is somehow maybe possibly related to the other. Or, to use a more fundamental example, Hitler drank water. Therefore, everybody who drinks water is bad. You can see how these sorts of one thing linked to so many others is bad, and just does not work at a logical level. And that's where this research gets to be kinda bullshit. The study, because it's claiming so many related events, just cannot be relied on the way it is. The idea that you could say that ultra-processed food is the cause isn't necessarily the case, because cardiometabolic issues, mental disorders, and mortality are not simply attributable to food alone. Environment, diet, physical activity, ability to be able to go to the doctor, especially for an American study like this. All of these are problems. And so, we have a big issue there already. But it gets worse, because the way this is presented, you would think it's original research, but it's not. And yes, you can use a study like this, but as the Guardians presented it as almost like original research initially, you need to not do that. Well, it's the Guardian. Expecting them to do a decent job in writing something is like expecting the sun to rise in the west. The research looked at a large group of studies and found that 14 of them, at least, were somewhat useful. And when they looked at this, they then looked at the roughly 10 million people involved, and you can see how this begins to get more and more diluted and difficult to figure out. But even if we were to take this at its face value, that is ultra-processed food and health issues, you can't just say that it's caused purely by the processed food. There is a general trend that in those that consume more processed food, they generally are in lower socioeconomic brackets, that is, they are poorer, less educated, often have difficulty getting decent food, are less physically active, and so on. And all of this contributes to these effects. It's not necessarily the food that is the cause, the food is one of the symptoms of their status. Other than the issues of agriculture and food, we have weird animal news, although perhaps calling them an animal is not quite right. It's a weird observation of worms living near Chernobyl. Worms actually should be more accurately described as nematodes, but nematodes being a form of flatworm, you can see where things might get confusing. What they've found is that in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, that's the area that's around the previously highly radioactive area of the Chernobyl power plant, there is a bizarre change in behavior of the nematodes. The worms appear to be adapting to their less than hospitable environment, and as a result, they're, gaining an advantage. They're evolving and adapting, a perfect example of evolution, to some extent anyway. What makes this research so interesting and useful is that the nematode goes through a generation very quickly. Because it processes each generation and therefore leads to a new generation very quickly, they're able to evolve in such a way that, you can get a lot of information very quickly. We can understand how adaptation to the nuclear environment, at least to some extent, has occurred, because there are some conserved genes between us and the humble nematode. Going from the animals in the environment to the environment alone, we have the Thwaites Glacier. The Thwaites Glacier is a rather large glacier that is arguably seen as the bulwark to drastic increases in sea level rises. That's because it prevents hot, or at least warm, seawater from getting to much larger areas of ice. The concern is that if this glacier was to collapse, we'd see, rather than a 2 feet or 0.6 meter rise in sea level, we'd see a 3 meter or 10 foot rise in seawater. And rising sea levels would not just have small effects, but entire cities could well be wiped off the map, or require that they become floating cities. The solution to this is, sadly, not to drop a giant ice cube in the ocean to prevent global warming. Rather, they want curtains. Giant curtains that are intended to be able to block the warm ocean water from getting to the glaciers. And in doing so, you would prevent them from at least somewhat melting. The challenge with this idea is twofold. One, when we say giant, we mean really giant, at 100 kilometers or roughly 62 miles of curtain. The second is that this ambitious plan requires $50 billion. If you've ever looked at curtain prices, this actually isn't too bad. Admittedly, if you ever need to buy 62 miles of curtain, you're probably doing something strange, but you would probably not be surprised to see this price either. The fundamental idea is that by sinking large concrete blocks or building them in the ocean and attaching the curtain to this, it would prevent the underside of the glacier from being slowly melted away by warm seawater. This would also in turn prevent the glacier from eventually being undercut and collapsing, adding considerably more ice to the ocean that's free floating, and then this ice in turn would melt. In further news, although this time purely focused on research and the risks therewith, we have a fund that has been announced to help with, let's say, the post-publication peer review process. Sort of, anyway. What it's meant to do is twofold. One is that it's $1 million over 4 years that is intended to allow for people who are looking into published research, whether it is a fraud like Dana-Farber Institute, or if it's trying to analyze published images for duplication or modification. The reason this fund is necessary is that, unfortunately, over recent years, there have been a series of reasonably high-profile cases where individuals called out bad research and were then sued by the people responsible for that research, largely in an effort to silence them. Unfortunately, lawsuits, particularly if you're in America, tend to be not just expensive, but they also tend to take a very long time. And unfortunately, at least in America, you do not get your money back if you win. because of this, if you get, let's say, sued by somebody because they don't like that you've criticized what they've done, speaking of this video, you could well find yourself going bankrupt. That's why this fund is a good thing, largely because it allows for the peer review process post-publication, and for generally speaking the just peer-reviewed publications as a whole to work better. It removes some of the threat around criticizing published findings. On the other hand, we do need to point out that $1 million, and especially over 4 years, isn't actually that much. And that's simply because most lawsuits will take much longer than 4 years, and they generally cost a lot more than $1 million to defend. And this is perhaps the most important thing, as all they're going to be offering is $25,000 to help with getting legal advice or administrative help at the initial stages of legal action. And that's a problem, because this is not just a initial problem. Rather, this is something that will go on for arguably years for individuals who are experiencing it, and, well, $25,000 is nice and it will help, but it's not going to add up to very much in the end. It's a drop in the bucket. And next we have a study looking at the possibility of graphene's role in the human body, and whether or not there could be concerns about whether or not graphene is actually harmful. One of the reasons why it's being looked into is simply that graphene can be used in so many ways and so effectively, whether it's as part of prostheses, implants, devices, and more. All of these things could be using it in incredibly productive ways. But if it turns out to be dangerous for the human body, we could well be destroying ourselves and part of the world while we're at it. The trial that was run looked at it in a very direct and literal sense, quite literally treating it as an environmental hazard by turning the graphene oxide into a nanoparticle that was suspended in air and then inhaled by 14 otherwise healthy volunteers. They then monitored the individuals for things like blood pressure, blood clotting, inflammation, lung function, and a few other things, every 2 hours, both during exposure and for 2 weeks afterwards. There was no obvious change in the respiratory or cardiovascular systems, which is a good thing, as having either inadvertently or advertently injured or killed 14 participants probably would not have looked great on their resume. In technology news, we have developments around batteries. For the most part, the current standard battery is going to be something like a lithium-ion battery. These require not just lithium, but also a electrolyte solution that helps to hold the lithium in and of itself, and then you have your cathode and anode. These tend to be rather volatile batteries if they're exposed to conditions in which they're not suited. There are other batteries out there, for example, lead acid, alkali batteries, or you have more recently salt-based batteries, but all of these have their own problems. Water batteries are arguably significantly less of a problem. They're also going to be considerably cheaper and theoretically far less toxic. The catch here is that they're not just based on water. They are based on water and a metal within the water. The metal acts as your carrier for the charge and allows for your anode and cathode to send the energy across and thereby create the charge that you use to run your device. The reason we haven't really seen water batteries before today is that they tended to be kind of dodgy. Well, not kind of dodgy, they were just outright bad. They had a really strong tendency to develop spiky metallic growths in them that would basically penetrate all of the various membranes that were supposed to be preventing the anode and cathode from touching. And because of this, they would short circuit and you would now have problems. In the case of lithium-ion battery, this would be gas-zoned explosions. Fortunately, at least, with water batteries, it's not that. It's just that it short circuits and you get a charge going where it shouldn't be. What prevents these batteries from undergoing that process and creating these spiny growths that penetrate the membrane is the formation of what is basically rust. It's an oxide layer. That oxide layer prevents the dendrites from forming and penetrating through. It also, to an extent, helps the batteries remain functional for longer. The study that was initially published found that there's about an 85% capacity after 500 cycles, which is pretty much on par with most standard batteries of the kind now. In other technology news, we have OpenAI responding to Elon Musk calling them out for being a closed AI. The reason for this is very simply that Elon Musk was involved in starting OpenAI, the idea being that, well, as the name would suggest, it would be an open source AI project. This would therefore allow individuals to be able to more effectively use the technology and knowledge generated from it. Of course, at the time, everybody's aware that even with the roughly $100 million in funding that was given to OpenAI, about $45 million from Elon Musk and $90 million from other donors, they were still going to have to get a certain amount of private funding and private companies involved in developing this, which is why they shifted from being open AI to a closed AI, of a kind anyway. And this is where the response is both honest and somewhat deceptive. First of all, they present themselves as being the good guys, which in any kind of business sense, there's nobody who's ever good. But more than that, they try and claim that Elon is acting somewhat hypocritical, which, to be honest, is marginally true. But it's also just as true that they themselves are being somewhat hypocritical. The idea they presented as a justification for this is that they are remaining true to the original mission of an OpenAI by making their tools available. Yes, but then again, so is Amazon Web Services, which is most certainly not an open platform. The other issue with the response OpenAI has is, well, they've provided us with a whole bunch of emails, but they've only provided one side of any of these emails, something that makes it very hard to accept that what they're saying is an accurate representation of what's going on. As such, it's rather, let's say, dishonest of them to present it this way, even if they are even remotely correct. In other AI-related news, it's a bizarre discovery that there is a way to make AI respond more effectively to your questions, and this is done simply by asking it to pretend that it's responding as if it were on Star Trek. Yeah, it may seem odd, but asking an AI or chatbot-like program to respond as though it is a trekkie actually seems to improve its capacity considerably. This discovery came from researchers trying to find ways to improve the responses from chatbots, and they don't actually know why, other than it has to do with its mathematical ability to process the question and answer more effectively. This, of course, also presents a problem, largely in the form of why. And unfortunately, we don't know why, which is another big red flag. Once AI starts doing things that we don't understand, we're in trouble. Shifting to astronomical news, we have yet another leak on the ISS. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, this leak is coming from a Russian section. And, well, this is not the first, nor is it likely to be the last. The concern, and it's admittedly at this stage a relatively minor concern, is that it's a small but growing leak. That would indicate that whatever's caused the damage is getting bigger. Most likely it's going to be another hole, but who knows. That's down to the fact that Russian cosmonauts claim to have found and fixed the leak, and yet the leak continues to happen. The final news item we have for you is the possibility that we have inadvertently populated the moon with tardigrades. Tardigrades, or water bears, or whatever you wish to call them, may well have, unfortunately, been populated on the moon by, well, the attempt to land on it by Israel. The attempted landing from Israel was a private venture, and it contained a range of payloads. One of these was a bunch of tardigrades. Tardigrades are also well known for their ability to survive in some of the more inhospitable environments, on Earth at least. We don't know how they're going to go on the moon. What we do know is that they were delivered to the moon when the parachute lander crash landed on the moon. And, well, now that they're there, it'd be curious to know what's happening with them. That's down to the fact that, well, they've survived far more violent impacts, which sounds horrible, but as we previously reported on, they can be fired at a surprisingly high speed and come out okay in the end. The tardigrade does have a uncomfortably common ancestor with creatures such as arachnids, and so we may have just inadvertently created the Starship Troopers universe. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.